All right, I think we can start now. We may have a few late arrivals, but I think most of our guests have come. I'm so delighted to welcome you this afternoon to this presentation of a conversation between Edna Hindson, who's co-author of a book that she's going to talk about, a polio survivor, and Nina Stoyan-Rosenzweig, who is a contributing editor to that book and is the archivist for the Health Science Center and a member of the staff, or the faculty rather, of the UF libraries. So this book presents Edna's personal experiences growing up with polio, and it was published by the Library Press at UF, and it's a unique volume. It's a scrapbook diary of Edna's experiences with polio in the 1940s. It's a daily journal written by her mother, who was in the front lines of the fight against the polio epidemic. And it describes her daughter's journey in her daughter's voice through the pain and loneliness of her life-changing illness. With the recent pandemic, the story of polio, complete with the work to develop a vaccine and how our world responded together, and the individual story of polio victims, it's all the more relevant today. And Edna and Nina continue to share this story through this presentation. I want to give you a little more background, though, about Edna before we begin. She was born in Lake City, Florida, the youngest of three daughters of A.K. and Lassie Goodbread Black. Her father graduated with a Juris Doctorate from UF Law School and joined the military. And while he was in the service, they started their family. And when they returned to Gainesville, Lassie pursued her own degree in agricultural sciences while studying and raising her children and caring for her family. She was the first woman to enroll at the UF College of Agriculture. So that's a pretty major accomplishment in its own right, and one I know that Edna's very proud of her mother for having that. In 2000, Mrs. Black was named a Great Floridian by the Florida Department of State. And as you can see, Edna has quite a kinship with UF through her family ties. Edna's own accomplishments have followed in her mother's footsteps because of Lassie's example and Edna's love for her home state. She herself has contributed to the well-being of North Central Florida. Among many interests and activities, she served at the Lake City Community College as the Disability Services Coordinator, where she helped pioneer programming, creating accessibility equity for people with disabilities. But another of her major accomplishments, we think, is the publication of this wonderful journal, my scrapbook of my illness with polio. And so we're very pleased to welcome Edna today in this conversation with Nina Stoyan-Rosenzweig about her experiences and about the book. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Nina, to begin the program.
All right, thank you very much, Judy. I'm going to actually give a brief background on the history of polio, especially polio in America. It looks like there are some people who have lived through polio in the audience, so for them it will just be a repeat of what they already know. But for our students, I know that the history of epidemic diseases can quickly be lost. They can be devastating while they are present, but then once they fade away, they're lost from the memory. So especially for the students, I wanted to just kind of give that brief background on the history and the prehistory of polio. Polio is believed to be an ancient disease that was perhaps first recorded or noted in the 18th dynasty in Egypt. The priest in this stele supposedly has a limb that's withered from polio, or from paralytic polio in particular. There's other evidence throughout history of polio, but it doesn't really become an epidemic infection until the 20th century. There are scattered outbreaks in America in the 19th century, 1841 and the 1890s, a 1910 epidemic in Washington, but it really gets started as a major epidemic disease in 1916 with a major epidemic in New York City. After that, summer polio outbreaks become a regular feature of life in America, and that continues until the 1950s. Now, polio is increasing in frequency while other infectious diseases, especially the crowd diseases, are dying out. You can see from the pink line in this chart that that represents infectious diseases. Those are declining with the exception of the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic, while chronic epidemic diseases are becoming the larger source of mortality. You can see, though, of course, that while the other epidemic diseases are declining, polio is increasing. So why is that? It actually has to do with sanitation. Now, these other diseases are also involved with sanitation, but they disappear or decline as US becomes a more sanitary nation. One thing, though, with polio is that it's increasing because sanitation means that the virus, which is spread chiefly through exposure to contaminated water, is encountering children at a later age. Now, you can be exposed to polio and have the non-paralytic form with flu-like symptoms. It's more of a stomach flu, or you can have the paralytic form. What you get tends to depend a lot on when you're exposed to it. Early exposure with lack of sanitation, children or infants encountering it when they still have maternal antibodies from breast milk, or they're still very young, are much less likely to have the paralytic form. So in a cleaner world, children were exposed at a later age and more thus got the paralytic form of polio. Many were paralyzed, of course, in America, and those who could not breathe were placed in an iron lung. And as the 20th century wore on through the 1930s and then into the 40s and 50s, scenes like this one, where you see a facility that has dozens of children in iron lungs, really became part of the public consciousness and really kind of raised a great fear of the spread. And it also changed how people lived. So towns might put up signs warning people not to come in because they have the polio infection within their boundaries, or children might be not allowed to enter a town because they might either spread the disease or come down with it. Whereas also regular bulletins and other forms of press gave people advice on how to avoid polio, keeping clean, avoiding mixing with groups, not getting overtired, not getting chilled. So there was that fear that changed the way people lived. That fear, though, was also kind of directed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, in 1929, at age 39, he was struck by a paralytic illness that was then diagnosed as polio. This paralysis was permanent, although he spent much of his later political career concealing the paralysis, and the press at the time supported that. They did not show him in wheelchair, and there are only a few photographs of him in a wheelchair, but he didn't conceal the polio. He publicized that widely. He also spent a fair amount of time as he was recovering, trying to become rehabilitated and to regain his ability to walk. He did that when he found his way to Warm Springs in Georgia. He spent some time there trying to regain movement in the springs. Although he didn't, as I said earlier, regain that ability to walk, he did purchase Warm Springs, which became a national home for polio rehabilitation and research, and later became the Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute for Rehabilitation. When he was elected president in 1932, or when he became president, it was known as the Little White House, and it's very important in the polio stories of many people. He also raised awareness of polio with his birthday balls, the first of which was held in 1934, and people attending would often bring big checks and would continue to provide money to support the fight against polio, both treatment and prevention. Very importantly, FDR also created the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis in 1938. This foundation and this effort encouraged Americans to send their dimes to the White House to help fund research. And this was later headed up by Basil O'Connor, who was part of the FDR White House and then focused on charitable organizations, especially the NFIP, which became known as the March of Dimes. And that was at the suggestion of comedian Eddie Cantor. In recognition of the connection of the dime with FDR, the Roosevelt dime was designed and struck in 1946. And the whole idea of spreading the word and providing dimes to help treat children was reinforced through much of the material that the March of Dimes produces. Also important in the treatment of polio was what became known as the Sister Kenny treatment. Elizabeth Kenny was a nurse who learned in the field and learned in the Australian bush where she was born. She served as a nurse in World War I, reached the level of sister, which was equivalent apparently to first lieutenant in the Australian Army. As she encountered in the Australian bush children who had polio, she split away from the conventional treatment of the time, which was to take children who were paralyzed and to immobilize their limbs in casts, braces, or splints. So basically children were immobilized, never had the opportunity to try to regain movement in their limbs. Her theory was that, and she develops it in 1931, that the paralysis is due to spasms in the muscles through the nervous system. And her idea was to reduce the spasms by wrapping limbs in warm or hot packs. And after this treatment of putting them in hot packs, then to move and manipulate paralyzed limbs. And this practice, although it took a struggle and she really had to fight the medical establishment, became standard in many places for work with polio survivors. Spreading through Australia in the 1930s and 40s, her method came to the United States with Sister Kenny in 1940 when she came over to demonstrate, teach, and preside over setting up programs. And that treatment, although at first it wasn't accepted, did later become part of treatment in many facilities. Of course, the March of Dimes continues to be active in raising awareness in order to raise money for prevention and treatment. But there also is a circulation of a lot of images that really try to involve Americans in the fight against infantile paralysis, to make them more sympathetic and to empathize with it, really to put a face on people who are suffering from polio. You can see the poster children. It was kind of the first modern effort to create a fundraising effort for a disease that involves showing individuals who were suffering from it. With all of this effort and funding, the vaccine research, which began in the 1930s, became a vaccine, the first of the vaccines in 1953 when Jonas Salk created the killed virus, was tested through 1954 and made available to the public in 1955. With the introduction of the vaccines, polio declined from 15,000 cases per year to 100 in the 1960s, 10 in the 1970s, and we have no wild type virus or polio cases in the US since then. Obviously, with the March of Dimes, activism and engagement were an important part of the story, and that was certainly an important part of the story for Edna's family. You can see her mother in the top right with Basil O'Connor, who was heading up the March of Dimes, as well as Helen Hayes. Telling the polio story became important. It was certainly important throughout the epidemic, and that was told through photographs of children in hospital wards with iron lungs, wheelchairs, and braces. But as those children grew, in retrospect, they published their memoirs once they were adults, telling the story of their life with rehab and polio, sometimes the stories of decades spent in iron lungs. People lived up to 50 years in the iron lungs if they never regained the ability to breathe on their own. It's been told more recently through oral history interviews. One thing to bear in mind, these stories rely on memory. Today we're discussing a unique story told at the time through a mother's eyes in a daughter's voice. So Edna, can you tell us about this journal and maybe kind of how we came to where we are, why the journal has been published by and how it came to be published by the press?
Yes, I'll be glad to tell that. You're a major part of this. You came to interview me on polio with a project that you were researching. And while you were here, I showed you copies of the journal that I transcribed before I sent the originals to the Smithsonian by way of Spalding. And I had transcribed them because they were falling apart, and you were very impressed even with my poor typing. And you said, you know, why don't I retype this for you and we'll get a couple of copies? And you did. And then you said, let's see if we can get it published. Now, this was a couple of years ago, so it has not been a short journey. We've worked on this project, but I feel like we've done well. It has become a book. And why is it important? It's just a little journal. Number one, there is no other journal written in this format that we can find. It was written in my voice by my mother. She wrote how she thought I felt going through this, and she recorded these events daily, which makes it special.
Definitely.
Does that tell you enough, or
It tells me enough. If other people who are attending this presentation have questions, please submit them through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I know that the journal tells us details of your experience, but I know that people will want to hear about it also through your own words. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of becoming sick with polio and about that, how that journey began?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I have a vivid memory of jumping rope at White Springs, Florida, where my mother was a home economics teacher. And I was waiting for her to get off duty and playing with other children. And that was the last time I remember being able to do activities such as that. And on the way home that day, I told her, I said, you know, I don't feel well. And she said, well, maybe you'll be better a little later on. But I did not get better. I became nauseous. Believe it or not, I had earache, which I've never heard of that being a symptom. Fever, drowsy. And during the night, I called to her because I couldn't use my left leg. And this is pretty terrifying for a 6-year-old to not be able to use the leg. So she came in and she was quite worried too. So the next day, even though my doctor thought maybe it was just a cold or flu, we all went together to St. Luke's Hospital in Jacksonville. And there they immediately put me in isolation ward. And mother could no longer be with me. She could go to the window outside of my room and try to explain to me what was going on. And that was followed by the spinal tap. And as I've told you before, I was not very cooperative while that was going on. And I'm sure the doctors, you know, remember me being very upset about needles being stuck in my back. So from that point on, I was in isolation for about 2 weeks. And amazing part of this book is the support that my family received while we went through this. In many diseases, people will shun the family. They don't want anything to do with them out of fear. That did not happen in Lake City and the surrounding counties. My father being state's attorney probably had a lot to do with it. But people would come and read to me on that patio right outside my room. That support meant a lot to my family. And from in isolation, I did have the Sister Kenny hot pack treatments. And they were very uncomfortable at that time. Later on, they were not quite as hot. But that was pretty shocking to me as a 6-year-old too, to try to understand why they were doing all of that. Now, would you like to come in and ask any more about the symptoms or isolation, or maybe the next couple of hospitals?
Well, I guess I know when you're in isolation, people would bring you things, but they couldn't ever get them back.
Absolutely. My poor cousin, Patsy Nelms, who lives here, she remembers vividly too, that she took very good care of her books and her puzzles and everything. And her mother said, Aunt Pa says, why don't you give those to little Edna Ray inside there and let her play with that when she's not having hot pack treatments? And we had to tell Patsy, you won't get these back. Everything that went in that room had to be burned, because at that stage, we still did not know about the virus and how cautious that we had to be.
So you mentioned that you had a lot of support and that your mother would come and sit outside the window with you for hours.
Yes.
How about, I know you had two sisters. Were they able to come visit you at all in the
Yes.
early stages?
Well, yes, they did. I got to be with them more when I was moved to another hospital, but they would come. And one sister would write little stories to me. She was very good in creative writing. And when I moved to the other hospital, both of them would dance for all the children that were in the ward, or they would play the accordion or write little plays for them. So they were very active.
Mhm. So St. Luke's was the first stop on your journey, and you mentioned other hospitals. So I think we could start talking about those. But first, how long were you in St. Luke's?
I would have to look at the book. I believe it was about 2 weeks, and I think they had to extend it a little bit. So it could have been like 2.5 weeks.
So they really wanted to make sure you were no longer infectious.
Right. And even when I moved to Hope Haven, it's also in Jacksonville, they once again put me in isolation, but it was a more relaxed isolation. Mother could come in the room with me, but they were carefully watching before they put me in the ward with the other children. Would you like for me to share a little bit about that isolation and the dollhouse?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Well, my mother did have to go back to work and could come late afternoon, hour, 2-hour drive, or she would come on the weekend. So it's not in the book about this, but in isolation, there was a marvelous dollhouse. And I now know that was probably the Abbey Rockefeller dollhouse that's located now in Williamsburg in a collection. Why it was put in my room, I have no idea. Of course, I couldn't touch anything. They had a glass wall or a glass covering over it, but I was still a very ill child then, and I could lie in my bed and just visualize playing in each one of those rooms and in the kitchen and the bedroom and all. And that brought me so much joy. And someday I would like to tell that family what that dollhouse meant to me.
That's wonderful. So when you got out of isolation, you had the dollhouse when you're in isolation and the other things that people brought to you, but you were allowed to have something special, I guess, when you're out of isolation.
Yes, I did. I cannot believe my mother and father made arrangements for me to have my pet canary bird. And we know this is true because we can see the bird cage in the different pictures that were made at Hope Haven. And you would think the nurses would have said, no, you can't do that. That brought a lot of joy to the children and to me too. And another event or special thing that happened, my mother bused her home economics students to Hope Haven. They couldn't come in the children's ward, but they could stand outside and they would sing songs to all the children in the wards, both wards for the boys and another ward for the girls. And they sang Bells of St. Mary's. And I'll never forget that. It just remains such a touching memory for me. Mm-hmm. Would you like other memories of Hope Haven or?
Sure.
Well, I'll share how bad I was too. When I first was moved out of isolation into the ward, I was so thrilled to be around children again. It'd been quite a while. And I would holler to the children all the way at the end of the ward and try to visit back and forth. And the nurses warned me several times that you must control the volume of your voice. Well, being 6 years old, I just didn't pay any attention. So one day they just came and got my bed and they rolled it down a hallway near the nursing station. And they said, when you learn to control your voice, you can go back and be with the other children. So I just thought that was, I wasn't a perfect little girl. I was just a normal little girl.
Certainly, and especially when you were really forced to stay in bed for so long. Like, were you
Yeah.
able to get out of bed at all?
No, not at all. I got in trouble about that one time too. But no, I couldn't even sit up. And we're talking 6 months. And then during maybe 3 or 4 months in, they let me turn over. And then they let me sit up a little bit. But that's a long time for a child to be in a bed. No wonder I misbehave sometimes.
I can certainly understand that. And it does seem like it's a very different approach to how we look at rehabilitation now, where we're trying to get people kind of up and moving as soon as possible.
Absolutely. But you will have digestive problems. You will have lose muscle. So it really was not a wise thing to do.
Mhm. So you were in Hope Haven for 6 months, or how
6
long?
months.
6 months.
6
And
months.
what was your next stop after that?
My next stop was a train ride to Warm Springs, Georgia. That you've given an excellent background, and I'm glad people could see how large that place was. It was really like a community college or small, well, let's just say a community college. Many buildings, beautiful, well maintained, thanks to Roosevelt. And my mother and I had been there just on a trip to look it over. And my family decided that would be a good place for me to go for rehabilitation, which I'm not sure how much rehabilitation I received there. But Nina, what I thought I would do, if we've got enough time, I thought we'd go on an imaginary trip around Hope Haven. Warm Springs.
I think we do have time, so let's do it.
Okay, so you signal me when we need to stop, because I can stop telling about each building and the purpose of the building, but it is interesting. I will tell about the first night that I was there, and I knew my mother, my sisters were going to be leaving me, and they helped me set up this little area. I had to go in the teenage room, which was a problem, because they would grab the back of my chair and they'd make fun of me crying and all. And a boy in an iron lung next door had died that same day. So that was a lot. I was 7 years old by that time. But I remember I stayed up all night looking out the window, hoping my mother would change her mind and come back and get me. Now, that's the sad part. And then I'm going to tell you the happy part of Warm Springs. Finally, I was moved in the children's ward, but my parents would not insist I stay in bed. The rest of the children had to, but I was given a wheelchair to go anywhere I wanted on that campus. And I took full advantage of that. I would get up in the morning, and the first place I would go, I would roll over to the therapy pool. I was not receiving therapy, but I could go inside as long as I was quiet, which is a problem, of course, for me. And inside you would see these beds, wooden beds that were maybe 6 or 8 of them in the pool with a little water on top of the patient, and the physical therapy working with arms and legs and talking very quietly to the patients. Then when I would leave there, I would go next door where they were sunbathing. And they were just like you see the chairs at a beach. They had patients around that area. I don't know how many, 8, 10, or 12 people. And they were sunbathing. And as a child, I was kind of shocked with the very thin legs and thin arms. And you could tell the people were very weak. My next stop was my favorite place, and that was a brace shop. That was your freedom to go home once you got your brace. But I would go in the door and I could hear the hammering of the metal where they were making the braces. And the people that worked in there would joke and tease around with me because I made my rounds there every day. And in the waiting room, it would be packed with people, either being measured for their bracing and their crutches, or they would have their brace and were trying to stand up, and the physical therapist helping them decide if it needed to be adjusted or not. And when I would leave there, my next stop would be to the educational building. And in there, they had the craft shop, would have people making pocketbooks and doing activities with their hands. And there was a library next door to that. And I would go in and try to find books for children, and there were none. And I would say, do you have any books with pictures in them? Because I didn't read at that time. And then I would go to where the classroom was, and I never did see anyone in the classroom. It may be I went there at the wrong time of day for their classes, but they evidently decided since I was just 7, they would wait on that until I got home. By then I'm tired, and so I called what we call push boys. And those were young people that were in good physical condition, and they were hired to push our chairs where we wanted to go on the campus. And they always made us smile. They would come wherever we were, where we got tired pushing our own chair. And I loved it because he would race up the hill right up into Georgia Hall, which looked like a huge hotel lobby. And that's where the adults at the end of that hall, a dining room, very formal, would have their meals, and they would have their cocktails at night in that lobby area. And then my next favorite place was where the push boy would push me down a sidewalk to where therapy was going on with people who had their brace now, and they were learning to go upstairs. They were learning to walk up ramps. They were learning how to get up when you fall. And by that time, I was getting fatigued, and the push boy would take me back to the children's ward for a nap. And at night, we had stories. Uncle Wiggily was one of my favorite stories. And then on the weekends, they would roll all of us over to that very big wooden building that you showed, and that was where we had movies. And that room would be packed with people on stretchers and in wheelchairs. So they tried very hard to make it a happy place. Now, I'm going to switch it back to you, so I won't keep rattling on.
All right. Well, so when you still, you got your brace there, how long was it before you had your brace?
It took us 6 months, and then I developed a curvature of the spine, and they said she's not ready to go home. And the reason I developed that is the wrong wheelchair I was in. And so Dad had my own wheelchair from home sent there, and they put supports in the wheelchair, and it wasn't too much longer, but it was a little over 6 months that I stayed there. But I had to go through what everyone else did, get my brace, get it adjusted, show them that I could walk with my crutches and my brace. And I used a hip pad at that time and back support because of the curvature. But once I left, I just left with my brace and my crutches and my wheelchair when I would become fatigued.
So you were there for how long? A year?
Warm Springs. It was a little over 6 months.
Okay.
7 months. That's in the book. Mother made a note about everything, so I'm sure that's in the book. But with my memory, that's what I remember.
Okay. That is a long time for a 7-year-old to be without your family. Were they able to come and visit at all?
Yes, they did try, but I would get so upset for several days. And they finally said, we think it's best if you don't come too often. She does fine. It takes her a day or two to readjust after you've come. But I distinctly remember some visits that my family made. I even remember what foods they brought me. I'd never seen a pomegranate before. My dad brought me a pomegranate and took me to Manchester, and Mother and the girls would come in and take me places. But like I said, I was not, it was too emotionally upsetting. So they said, let's cut back on that.
So once you were had your brace and you left Warm Springs, did you go back home and just settle back into life with your brace? And
Right. Well, there were only 2 weeks left in the second grade, so they let me go and just sit in there, but I was so far behind. I missed most all of the first grade, second grade, and they put me in third grade. And that was, everyone else could read and write and spell and all, but I was very much behind. It took me quite a while because it affected my self-confidence, knowing I was the least educated person in the room. But I eventually caught up by at least the seventh grade, and then I became very active in student government. I was on student council throughout my high school years. I was voted to go to Girls Nations. I was nominated for, Girls State, and then nominated for Girls Nation. I was voted most likely to succeed. So I think I did all right. My education was kind of weird. I took courses according to what floor they were on. So that meant if chemistry was on a certain floor and I was in ninth grade, I would go ahead and and then my senior year, I had to take general biology. 2 weeks later, I was taking at University of Florida summer school, advanced biology. So it was a rather weird educational setup.
Certainly. Well, and I guess that was for accessibility reasons.
Exactly, because I had to carry, I used crutches and my brace during that time, and I had to carry books. So they were trying to figure out a way I could physically do it. And we had stairs in the high school where I was. Mm-hmm. So it's, this is well before Americans with Disability Act, and that's the next chapter. It is Florida State University.
So I guess we can go on and start talking about your experiences at Florida State, or we can open it up to questions, whichever you prefer.
Oh, that's fine with me. We can make Florida State very short. I was elected senator at Florida State, and one of the reasons is I wanted to be able to do some disability awareness. I work with the traffic department, and I stress that, the disabled do want to attend the university, but we can't go down those steps without a handrail. And we really don't need someone every semester to tell us that we can't use our leg. Once it's paralyzed, so I got that changed where I didn't have to go get a physical exam every semester. But that's enough right there. I was in a sorority and I was active with campus politics.
I remember though, I actually have other questions about that experience, if you don't mind my asking them. Remember, like at one point, there's something to do with parking?
Yes, I did work with the traffic department, and they did try to help me, but I had to stress upon them that I was not leaving. And to give you an example of that, the first week I was there, there was a biology CLEP exam. And I was encouraged to go ahead and try that because I didn't have a lab at University of Florida. I just had the course. So they said, you really need to get in there. If you can CLEP that, you don't have to take a lab here. So I went and I said, I need a parking place where I can go into that exam. And they said, well, you just park anywhere you want to, and we won't give you a ticket. I said, okay. So the time for the exam, I could not find a parking place. So there's a fountain outside of the main building where I was to have this exam. So I just pulled half of my car up on the edge of that fountain area, and it blocked traffic going around the loop there, and went in and took my exam. And I got a little tap on my shoulder saying, you need to move your car. I said, no, you need to move my car. Here are the keys, and you go find a parking place. So they listened to me a little bit better after I made a a little scene about that. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Because I've got some other ones.
Well, that's the one that I remember, but if there's anything else, and I think there are many things that people today don't even realize were affecting people with accessibility challenges. And so it is maybe a reminder of how important that is to still be aware and to keep putting curb cuts into curbs and things like that. So
Wow.
what are some of the other challenges you faced at Florida State?
Well, they worked with me as best they could with traffic, and I tried to remember other people have to park there too. And we could park on campus back in '57. I would have to get up very early in the morning, let's say if it's a building, educational building, the other end of the campus, and those places filled up early. So I can't even tell you how early I would go, and I would park my car, and then I would study in my car until time for class. But that way I knew I had a parking place. I remember from my graduation picture, they had it located. I see in the back of you this bell tower. Well, the place where we were to go at Florida State to get our picture made for our graduation, and I had a BS and a master's, was at the top floor of that building. So I remember I made it up there. By the time I sat down, if you look at the annual, you will see I'm just about ready to cry. But I made it. That's the important thing. I made it. And perhaps that's why I have been so diligent to try to help other people make it through the system. And my work at Lake City Community College, which is Gateway now, that was such a joy to me to be able to help others with disability find accommodations and let them help figure out how can we solve this. So
do you want to talk about, when did you start at Lake City?
Oh, good question. Let's see. Stop and think. 68, something like that, because I had been in public education up until then, and then I worked at the college, and then I retired in 95. But that was the most rewarding of any occupation or that I've ever had in my life, is to help others get through. Hired sign language interpreters and readers, and I had a person in Lake City donate a golf cart. I just out and out asked her, would you donate one? And she said, sure, nobody's ever asked me before. So I had a golf cart so we could transport those students that had trouble. And it wasn't just the physical. We had students had trouble coping. And it was quite interesting. We did win twice at the national level with our disability awareness programs. I felt, and I was made professor emeritus upon my retirement in 95. And is that too much or about?
No, you can certainly tell us more about it. Well, let me go back though. And you mentioned that you were in public education. What did you teach and where?
Well, I'm certified in mental retardation, or really from kindergarten through 12th. And at one time, that was a very rare major back in, and let's see, I graduated in 64, 65, and I had a nursery in Perry, Florida. I married an attorney from there. And in the school system there, that was their first year to have special ed. And I had my certification there, so I worked in that area. And I also worked in that area in Columbia County for a number of years with trainable, educable students, wonderful, delightful. I had equipment in my classroom. We cooked, we had a gardening, it was just a joy. I used my music a lot there too, my auto harp.
Well, I know that in the book you talk a lot about music lessons, and your sisters had to learn to play instruments. What instrument did you learn to play, or instrument?
Well, I played quite a few. I played piano for 12 years, and I played flute in our band, and in an orchestra in Jacksonville. Auto harp. Have stopped to think what I did play, but I played quite a few, and my sisters did too. Mother and my father were big believers in music, and my sister became a music therapist, and that's another area I'm a strong believer in using more music therapy at all different levels of people who are ill.
And was that something that you had at all when you were in any of the different facilities? Did they offer any form of music therapy?
No, there was none. I guess it's a pretty new idea in the 50s. But my sister was the first music therapist in the state of Florida. You graduated from FSU.
Mm-hmm. I can just think about how wonderful and valuable that would have been when you were in isolation, or when you were in bed for 6 months, just having music. Because I guess at that time there was no television in any of these facilities.
No television. I doubt they would let you have a radio in isolation. And here you are in bed with these hot packs on you. And what if I didn't have family and friends from North Florida that would come and read or be with me? Or that's pretty cruel. But if someone had come in or been outside the room playing the guitar, or just humming or comforting, it would mean so much. Personal experience that I've had fairly recently in 2015, one of my sons passed away, and during the hours I had to sit by his bed, someone came in and played the guitar. And that meant a lot to me. And he hummed along with them. So it gave them comfort during these really hard times.
Mm-hmm. That is, and I guess I was asking you about your teaching, and then I got off track a little bit. But so you did use music in your classroom then? I
did. And the in between years when I would maybe not teach the full year, where I might do substitute teaching, that would fascinate children, to go in with your auto harp and just start playing and singing little songs. And then usually they would say, what happened to your leg? And then I would show them my brace and show them how you take it off, you put it on, and why I'm wearing it, and what is polio. So both of those were educational tools.
And I guess then so what led you to leave the education, or at least elementary school education, and go into college level work?
Well, it's kind of sensitive. I was going through a divorce, and I needed just some time off to adjust. And I'm sure many people understand that. And then I was ready to go back to work. I was serving on lots of committees, and I volunteered most every day at a different place, and historical museum, or the Stephen Foster Memorial, or progressive employment, or just all these different organizations. And I thought, well, you just as well go back to work, because you're going out every day. And so I was lucky enough with Dr. Heimer to be hired. Mm-hmm. And that was a joy of my life, is to have that position.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are questions, and so maybe we can take some time to answer. I've been obviously asking you all of the questions, and I know people are out there waiting to ask you some things. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions from other people.
Hi, Edna. So I'm Hal. I'll be asking questions from the chat and the audience today. we had several people who are interested in whether you have encountered post-polio syndrome, and if you can explain what that is to us.
Yes, that's a very good question, and I should have covered that. That is why I retired from Lake City Community College. I also did international programs. I led groups to Europe during the summer because I have an extensive background through my mother with organizing educational tours. And it became harder and harder for me to do that. And I finally had to ask the president could I be relieved from that and someone else take on that, trip to Europe and keeping up with the tickets and arrangements and all. And then it became harder to move between the buildings. And I was very fatigued in the afternoons. So I decided I'm going to go ahead and retire. I've got enough years I can do that. But it is a very wicked part of polio that people are just now learning about it. And I've described it to other people like you do a car that runs on 8 cylinders. And then you find out that you're down to about 3 cylinders now. You can do things, but you can't do them the way you once did it. And when you get fatigued, you're very fatigued. I have moved from using just a brace walking to using a brace and a cane. And then I'm now using a walker and a wheelchair. And it is progressive.
And I guess I can give a little bit more background. A lot of people who had polio and then went through rehabilitation and regained movement, I guess in some cases, who had been in an iron lung and then were able to breathe on their own. As they started getting older, they found that they were losing kind of the gains that they had made through rehabilitation. And that's been a concern for, I guess, every polio survivor. That to really wonder how far back they'll kind of go in terms of the gains that they made. Yeah. So, and in fact, you and I met through the post-polio group.
That's right. That's right. And now we no longer have that group because the person that was very active, her post-polio syndrome has become such, it's too difficult for her to carry on, planning those meetings and traveling and all.
And I know that there was a challenge when those symptoms first started appearing, that doctors weren't familiar with that, and they didn't, they just kind of put it down to like, quote, normal aging, and didn't realize that it was much more significant for people who had polio.
Absolutely. So more questions?
Yeah, I think someone in the audience might have taken a peek at your book already because they would like to hear about a watermelon story involving your dad.
Yes, that's a good one. My dad, of course, being a state's attorney for the 3rd Judicial Area, had to travel to the different cities for court. So he was a very busy person. But he did everything he could. He would bring the children nuts. He would bring them. This is at Warm Spring, Hope Haven. He would bring them watermelons, and he would try to figure out nice things to do for the children that were in the wards. I don't think there would be another family that was more supportive than mine. My sisters and my mother and father. And our neighbors, our friends, really got a lot of support. More questions?
Yeah, I think several people had, I think, personal questions about, how you found your confidence in, dealing and overcoming your experience with polio. And we're wondering if you could share a little bit more about, your, I guess, philosophy about success in life and, you know, dealing with difficult times and this disease?
Well, you know, that's another area I would love to see more of. And my mother was, and my Aunt Thelma, they were always providing books to read. And one of them I remember was Heidi. Remember that book? The little girl in Switzerland, and how her friends loved her so. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. But my mother and my family would informally channel books to me that were encouraging. My mother especially, that's how I got into my hobby of bonsai in the first place, is my mother gave me a book about it. And she talked about these trees on the West Coast that are battered in the wind and their limbs are broken, and how they are made into these beautiful, valuable trees. And that's the way we have to be, is that we have to look at these hardships in life that come, and the storms and the winds, and we can overcome them, but we have to hold firm. And another thing that I've learned in my hobby is that if you can't go to the forest, well, bring the forest to you. Make a miniature forest with plants and trees. In fact, just this last month, I'll say it, creative or developed a forest that reminds me of what it felt like to walk in a forest. But it is difficult now for me to do that. I can't do what I once did. So I'm bringing nature to me, and trying to figure out ways to enjoy being who I am. This is the only life I'm going to have. You can either face it and accept it and try to find how to cope in some other ways. My friends here at Okamuk will tell you, when we have a dance here, they laugh at me, and that's fine. I dance in my chair. You know, I'll move around to the music and everything. So I dance, but I dance in a different way. And also I have a wheelchair that I use every now and then. And you know, these tennis shoes that children wear with a sparkle where they step, I had those type wheels put on my wheelchair. So when I'm rolling along, people will look at me and interact, and they'll smile. And usually people won't look at you if you're in a wheelchair. They were taught by their mothers, don't do that. But I want them to look at me and accept that I am part of society, the same as anyone else. And there's nothing wrong. There's nothing to be ashamed of. This is who I am. But I do believe in reading books of other people, or looking at programs of other people that have had life events to cope with, instead of just, you know, not even trying to figure out how to go on with your life.
That is a great attitude. Speaking of wheelchairs, we did have a question about, you know, thanking you for your work with the ADA, and asking what your thoughts are about, you know, trying to find equity for people with disabilities.
Okay, trying to find, well, we have to participate in organizations such as Transportation Disadvantage. We have to figure out some of these problems, because the disabled in Lake City would say, yeah, I'd love to go to work, but I live 15 miles from town. I can't get to that job. So I volunteered on Transportation for Disadvantage, working with the state with funding, because, you know, they had a limited budget too, and we had to be careful that the routes and all were appropriate. Another one to try to equal the playing field for people was progressive employment in Lake City. I served on that for many years, and it's a group of counselors that we met together, and we said, where are the jobs in Lake City? Who would be willing to give this person with a disability a job? We'll get the transportation kind of worked out. You give them a chance, and we give you a job coach to help them adjust. They may have to be retrained, may not work, but we'll work together to see what we can do. And of course, I work with CARC too with their workshop. But anyway, the answer to that is get active with these groups of people that are trying to make an equal opportunity for everyone. And every now and then you have to fight. Like I have fought, when you have something that does not seem right, well, call the newspaper. So would a reporter come and talk to me? I want to see what they thought about this. And would you do an article about this? They're not letting this person work here, or they're not letting this person, because of the way they look, have a job. Would you write up an article about this? And let's see what the public thinks about it. If I'm wrong, tell me.
Great. As a polio survivor, what is your perspective on the current COVID pandemic, given that it is also another virus that seems to affect people in very different ways?
I'm glad that came up. And due to the present situation, I feel like I'm going to go ahead and stick out my neck on that one. Let's go back and look what happened. I was looking for my notes, but I know it by heart. Let's look what happened with polio. We had the March of Dimes develop. The communities in the United States said, let's work together to get the money for a vaccine. We've got a president who had polio. He can give us leadership to get this job done. And what did the United States do? They earned this money to research about the virus. And it wasn't in a month or two. We're talking years. My mother would come back from these conferences and I would say, well, do they have a vaccine yet? And she would say, no, you've got to be patient. They don't want to give this out till it's safe for everyone. And finally, we did get the vaccine, but it took a community working at the local and the national level and the top level with the president to do this. Another thing, we had compliance. I don't think there were too many communities that said, we are not going to close our pool. I don't know of any. Nina, am I right or wrong?
I don't know of any.
I don't think there was any community said, we are not closing our theater. We need to make money with the theater, so we are not closing. There was more support with polio, I really believe, than the present situation. And I'm trying not to get too political, but I do, in my heart, feel like this is the problem. Nina, stop me if I'm going.
No, I think you're being diplomatic, Edna.
Any questions?
So what would, in dealing with COVID, I think there are expectations that a vaccine will be, forthcoming. What would you say to someone who has concerns about the vaccine or in general about vaccinating their children?
Nina, I think you're more qualified. I can blunder through it, but I think you'd be more factual if you could step in on that.
Well, I think for many people who choose not to vaccinate their children, some of it is an emotional reason, even more than factual. And in some ways, you can speak to that emotion more than I can, because you've lived through a world without the vaccine, and you know what a difference it can make.
Right. It really breaks my heart when I hear people say, I am not having my child vaccinated with this disease or that disease or whatever. And I'll say, have you really researched that? What do the scientists say about that? Have you gotten on Google and really researched it? Are you just listening to one person saying that this causes some children to be autistic? Let's, get the facts. And the facts are they need to be inoculated. They need the vaccine. Use what science has taken so many years to develop. They have the factual information of control group and non-control group, not for a couple of months like we're in now. I'm talking years. And it may take that long, but there will be other viruses. And are we ready? No, we're not. So I have hope from today forward. I'm trying not to be political, but I am. That we will get very serious about the death toll that we're seeing each day, and that we will get ready for the next one. Let some of these people who don't want the polio vaccine come visit me for a day and let me show you my body and what I've had to go through. Maybe I can change your mind. And I did put that in the book a little bit about if I change one person's mind about vaccine, the book will be worth it. Back to you, Nina.
Well, I guess for me, it kind of goes back to how quickly people forget the impact and how devastating an infectious disease like polio can be. And it's hard to retain that that sense of urgency when the disease is gone. And, it's like public health anywhere. When it's working, you think that it's not needed because there are no diseases, and you don't realize how close you are to the edge of illness.
Well, before we run out of time, I sure would like to thank some people. I don't know if we're to that point. Do we have more questions?
We do have several questions.
Okay.
Let's see. We had one person ask if you had any experiences with an iron lung.
No, I didn't have that type polio. I had the paralytic, not the bulbar. So I was not in an iron lung, but I did see iron lungs, not many of them at Warm Springs. They actually were housed at a different location. And Nina, I don't remember right off where they had most people with iron lungs located during those years. I know they did have a few, though there was one person that died the first day I moved into Warm Springs, and he was in an iron lung.
I know iron lungs were so huge that they could be terrifying. And I know a story of someone who was hospitalized for something else. It wasn't polio, but he was put in a ward that had iron lungs, and he was terrified because they were large and they were noisy. And
They are very noisy, and you really don't want to stay anywhere close to it. And I have been by it. We had a person in Lake City that lived in an iron lung for years, and I used to visit him. But just the sound of that machine is just, you just want to leave. It's a kind of a sucking sound, you know. And here I go again, but you smell like rubber, or there's a certain smell with the iron lung that they can't help, you know. But it was his life. That was the only life he was going to get, and that was where it was going to be.
So I think we have time for one more question. Someone would like to know a little bit more about your mother and her perspective on the scrapbook that she collected. And while I'm on this topic, I would like to let everyone know that we're putting information in the chat about how you can get a copy of the book.
Good. That's interesting too. My mother was so unusual. I would go with her when she did her demonstrations around the state of Florida and all. but she never made me feel like I was put on display. If I wanted to talk to the group, fine. If I didn't, that was fine. And she did the same thing with her journal. She knew the time would come when I would want her to sit down and talk to me about it, but she didn't make that much over it, really. I found it by accident with a group of, I think they were cousins. It could have been Patsy, I'm not sure, or neighbors. And we had found the scrapbooks, and there were 2 or 3 scrapbooks, not just one. And we were going through it, and that's probably how they got pulled out of order too. And we were reading it aloud to each other. And Mother came in and she sat on the bed and we talked about it a little bit. And that's my only memory of my mother talking to me about the journal, was that informal talk on top of a bed with a group of young people. Any other?
You were going to you had some people you wanted to thank, and then
I do.
we will have some concluding remarks.
Okay, I really would. Of course, I want to thank the Rotary, a big time thanks for the Rotary. You know, once the March of Dimes was turned into more of birth defects, polio kind of faded out, except with Bill Gates and the Rotary organization. They have carried the torch all over the world, and they haven't given up yet. They've come close. And Nina, you probably know the figures better than I do about, we still have active polio in the world. It's not over. But I do believe the Rotary and Bill Gates, they're gonna eliminate this. Wouldn't that be wonderful? No, but the braces and crutches and ironlings will be in museums and not on people's legs or helping them breathe. So I definitely want to thank the Rotary and Bill Gates. I would like to thank the Smathers Library, and especially Judy, for her guidance through all this, because at any point, your dean may not think that this is worthy, but she did recognize it's worthy. And Tracy McRae Radcliffe, her work on the graphics, and then Laurie and Nina and Tracy, we all worked together. And it was a long period of time. It's kind of like developing the vaccine, isn't it? It took a while, and I even doubted that it would ever happen. But I'm so glad that we have done this. And let's see, who I've left out. Salk and Sabin for sure. And the March of Dimes. And personal friends. I won't get into all the names of personal friends that have been so supportive. Nina, can you think of anything else that we've left out? I think we've covered a lot.
I would like to relay to you that the University of Florida Library Leadership Board thanks you for this valuable, interesting, and relevant presentation. And this comes from Michael Price, Chairman of the Library Leadership Board.
Wonderful.
And with that, I would like to introduce Melissa Rethlefsen, who is the Associate Dean and Faculty Director of the Health Science Center Libraries, and she's going to give us some concluding remarks.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I really want to thank Edna and Nina for this really fabulous discussion on such an important topic. Personally, my step-grandfather had polio and had a brace, and I spent this past hour in part regretting that I'd never had the opportunity to talk to him like we've had an opportunity to talk to you today, Edna. So thank you so much for your time and your generosity in being with us here today. It was a real privilege to learn more from all of your experiences. And Nina, thank you for doing such a fantastic job leading us through this discussion, and also to Hal for helping to moderate. And of course, as Edna already mentioned, we really want to thank the Library Press, especially Laurie and Tracy and Judy, for making this possible. and for making Edna's story available as a book. I hope that you all are going to have an opportunity to read and enjoy my scrapbook of my illness with polio. We are going to be sending an email out to everyone who attended today with information on how you can access and how you can purchase the book. And if you do purchase the book, it will also come with a special book plate that Edna will sign, so you can get a personalized signature from her, which will be a really special treat. So I'd like to thank all of the other colleagues that we have in the libraries too, who helped put together this fantastic event. And I'd like to thank each of you who attended today for your time and all of your questions. So thank you very much. And this concludes our session.
Great. Thank you.